Gregory.
Hello, Polly. How are you?
Oh, good. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you? Look at thunder. That's me. So sorry.
That's okay. Who's on our sweaty podcast today?
Wow. Well, we went a different route of prevention, but this is discrimination. And we are with the South Coast Fair Housing Organization.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So they're going to talk to us about housing discrimination, something that I think I may have heard of, but I definitely am not familiar with.
No, I thought you just kind of on a lot. Like, well, I mean, besides like blatant,
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I didn't know about the different classes, protected classes,
Mhm.
things along that nature. So we got to get a great education on this discrimination and how this organization is helping to eliminate that.
Nice.
So yeah, we have the executive director, Kristina da Fonseca.
Yeah.
You're probably going to be upset.
Yeah.
Probably didn't say it the right way.
You said it right the first time.
All right. So I do apologize if I said it wrong, but I know that Kristina is going to do a great job. Let us all know about the great work that's being done over at South Coast. And I can't wait to hear more.
Awesome. Me neither.
All right. So without further ado. Joining us today on the Totally Preventable podcast, we have the executive director of South Coast Fair Housing, Kristina da Fonseca. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing good. Doing good.
Yeah. A little hot in the office today, but good.
We should put that in our fair housing.
Yeah. You do office work?
Yeah. It is. In our office, it's like one side is boiling and the other side is freezing. Mm-hmm. So you got to stand right in the middle in order to become.
Oh no, that's terrible.
So enough about our problems. Kristina, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you wound up as the executive director?
Sure. So I am an attorney, and I started doing fair housing work back in law school and out in Western Massachusetts. And then over the years, myself and a few other individuals decided to start South Coast Fair Housing to provide the same type of services in Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. And so that's how I came to be doing this work. And we are the only, as far as I know, the only nonprofit fair housing organization that does the exact kind of work that we do. We're the only one that's ever existed in Rhode Island. And we've been around for in Rhode Island, we've been here in about 6.5 years so far.
Wow. Now I'm a Western Mass boy. So where Western Mass did you start off at?
So I went to school I was actually I did my undergrad in Northampton, and then I was in Springfield for law school, and then I worked at the Massachusetts Fair Housing Center, which was based in Holyoke.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So it's kind of around those.
Yeah. So I was born in Holyoke, lived in Holyoke for a while, and then moved over to Springfield when I finally got my chance to branch out on my own. So yeah, very familiar with all that. So great work. I knew we were connecting.
Yes.
That Western Mass connection. Right.
Yep.
Can you explain to us what housing discrimination looks like?
Yes. So it can vary. So for us, I sort of describe it as like a prohibited kind of activity plus a protected class. So the fair housing laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of a whole bunch of protected classes, including things like race, color, national origin, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. And so if there is like a refusal to rent or sell to someone, or charging someone extra fees, or telling someone that, you know, maybe they should live in that other neighborhood or that other community, right? Those are all examples of like prohibited behavior. And if the reason for any of those behaviors are because of a protected class of the person that they're doing that to, then that's kind of the activity that's prohibited under that's housing discrimination. It looks different now than it did typically, you know, in earlier in like the 60s, right? Especially depending on the specific protected class that's at issue. Often, discrimination on the basis of race or national origin or sex, or even sexual orientation, those protected classes, when there's discrimination on the basis of those protected classes, it's usually not done overtly and openly. Um, we sort of refer to it as like discrimination with a smile. So, you know, an individual may be, you know, interacting with a landlord, and that landlord may be sort of on openly treating that person nicely, but may lie to them about and say, "Oh, I just rented that unit; it's no longer available." Or maybe they'll, you know, tell them a higher rent amount, without saying to them, I'm telling you a higher rent amount than the other person because of your protected class, right? So a lot of discrimination now doesn't happen openly. The most open forms of discrimination that we see now or these days are really focused on um, folks with disabilities and folks with housing vouchers. So it looks a little bit different in those situations because there's usually not enough awareness about the fair housing laws, and so landlords or real estate agents are more likely to more openly discriminate against folks with those protected classes. Does that sort of make sense?
Does can you give an example of a discrimination on someone with disabilities? Just like an example.
Yeah. Yeah. So under the fair housing laws, folks, the definition of disability is like broader than what one might think of as a disability for someone who may qualify for disability income benefits. So that's sort of first. And the fair housing laws also offer additional protections specifically for people with disabilities that include um, what we call a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification. And so a reasonable accommodation is like a change to a rule, policy, or practice that would allow a person with a disability to have equal use and enjoyment of their housing. And a reasonable modification is a change to the physical structure of the building, like adding on a ramp, widening doorways, and other kind of modifications like that. And so quite often when we work with individuals with a range of disabilities, it is in the context of a denial of a reasonable accommodation request or a reasonable modification request that they're usually coming to us. And those sort of behaviors by real estate agents or landlords in terms of refusing to modify a policy or refusing to allow a modification to a property, those are all examples of discrimination that we see more frequently involved with folks with disabilities.
Does this apply to just like a landlord of a single family home that has to abide by these laws? Like, I'm just thinking, like, if you were just a single family home and all of a sudden someone's like, you need to widen all your doorways for me. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so there are two kind of questions built into that, or two answers kind of built into that question. One is that in Rhode Island, most landlords are not going to be responsible for paying for those kinds of modifications. So typically, typically a tenant could request the ability to make those modifications, but the landlord wouldn't be responsible for paying for them. And so in with the exception being that if a property is funded by the federal government, like if it has if it's a public housing authority or if it's subsidized housing, a private subsidized housing development, then in that case, that housing provider may in fact need to pay for those modifications. Um, that is sort of the to address your modification and payment question. But I think the other question about whether any of these laws may not apply to folks who are in like smaller with a smaller number of units, right? I think the other laws will generally apply to all type of housing, or the general prohibitions against discrimination, including the right to ask for a right, for the ability to make changes to the unit. Most properties, landlords will in fact be subject to all of those laws, except that in Rhode Island there are just a couple of exemptions. And so, for example, the prohibition against discrimination on people using housing vouchers or public assistance, that does not apply to owner-occupied properties that have 3 or fewer units. And then there are also um, some more rare exemptions in the case of discrimination against families with children. But other than that, there's really in Rhode Island, if you're if you own a duplex and you're renting out the other side, you're going to be subject to, the vast majority of these laws that we're talking about today. Just the same as someone who, may own 3 different large apartment buildings.
How often does housing discrimination occur in Rhode Island, or how often do you see?
Yeah, so of many years ago, there was this nationwide study done that found sort of that there are about 1 million incidents of housing discrimination per year across the country. It did not include, it didn't specifically include like certain forms of housing discrimination, but that sort of gives a ballpark of what we're looking at. I think in Rhode Island, right, like we've only been doing this work for about 6 years here. And so it's hard for us to really be able to quantify something like that. I think part of the challenge in quantifying something like that is that number one, many times folks don't realize that they've experienced discrimination, partly because of what we talked about earlier, which is that a lot of discrimination is not done openly, but also partly because many people don't know what the laws prohibit. And because sometimes discrimination is so common that it's sort of viewed as like, that's just how the housing market operates, and people don't realize that it's actually illegal. So that's also a barrier to sort of getting a solid number or even an estimate. Then the other issue is that people don't know really where to go, and how to pursue their rights, and also many people don't have time to or an interest in reporting their experience, just because they feel like maybe they won't be believed, or maybe they don't feel like they have enough evidence. I personally think that, given our experience in Rhode Island so far and the stories that we've heard, and we do a lot of trainings of various groups. And so I think based on what I've heard and what we've seen, I think discrimination is happening frequently. And it's just not getting reported, or it's not known about. I think the other thing that I look to sort of identify whether or not discrimination is really happening is what are the are there still segregated neighborhoods in Rhode Island, right? And if you look at the breakdown of demographics across various cities and towns and neighborhoods, we can see that many of us are still living in segregated neighborhoods, and that just doesn't happen by accident. That is a consequence of many, many years um, of discriminatory policies, government policies, but also of a buildup of individual discriminatory practices performed, by individual landlords and real estate agents. And so until we start seeing a significant reduction in the amount of segregation in where we live, that I won't feel like, we've significantly reduced the individual instances of discrimination in the marketplace. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. I feel like it would be hard to tell in cases where people weren't like overtly saying it, because the housing market is so difficult these days. So I would imagine if you have an apartment or house that opens up, you must have many people come and apply for it. So, how do you determine when 8 families apply that if someone is being discriminatory towards 1 or 2 of the families? That must be very difficult.
yeah, it is. And I think that makes it difficult for individuals, right, to identify even on their own, right? Oh, why was I denied? Why didn't I get a call back? Is this how everyone is treated, or is this just because of the sound of my voice or because of my accent, right? And so I think one of the ways that we try to uncover evidence of discrimination is through fair housing testing, which is like secret shopping, but for housing discrimination.
Mm.
And so we have testers that work for us, so who we will assign work to them where, they will contact a landlord or a real estate agent or whomever, to ask about an available home, and we'll have multiple testers contact the same party. And if we're looking for discrimination on the basis of disability, on the basis of disability, for instance, right, we may assign some testers with disabilities and some testers without disabilities, and then review their reports back to us to see feel like, if we see maybe all of the people without disabilities were offered an application and encouraged to apply, but maybe all of the people with disabilities were, discouraged from applying or directed to a different neighborhood or a different building. Um, and that's kind of how one of the tools that we have that we can use when individuals call us and say, I just didn't feel right about this call. I feel like it could have been, because of my accent or because I'm a woman or whatever, right? And we can sort of see if we can identify a pattern of behavior. It is difficult now with the housing market the way it is, right? Most tenants, I think, or most prospective tenants are not getting return calls back. And so, I think I think there are more and more people that are having difficulty in the housing market. But I do also think that with a market like this, it becomes much easier for folks who want to engage in discrimination to engage in discrimination and not be uncovered. And so, I think the more that folks can talk about this, can contact us with their experiences or to report something that just didn't feel right to them, then I think that the more that we can investigate, target our resources, and try to encourage, take steps to ensure that the fair housing laws are complied with moving forward. And and I think in that way, right, we can get to a place where future housing discrimination can in fact be totally preventable, right? If we can start breaking down these practices, then we can make it happen less and less into the future.
Right. So I feel like we laid the foundation. Now it's time to build the house. What What is South Coast Fair Housing?
Oh, we just jumped right
Yeah.
into
Yeah. So so our mission, right? We are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to eliminate housing discrimination and increase equal housing opportunities. So we really focus on that core component of discrimination as it relates to any part of the housing market, whether we're talking about rentals or sales, or even applying for a mortgage. And we do that. We set sort of our do a few things in our work. We have kind of three buckets of work. One of them is through educating the public or educating various groups about fair housing. The other is what I refer to as our enforcement work, which includes both, our work with individuals who call us for help. We may offer them with legal representation. We have attorneys on staff, including myself. And then we also have and part of that is also our investigation work, which includes our fair housing testing, which I just talked about. And then kind of our third bucket is what I refer to as our advocacy work or our policy advocacy work, where we're really trying to examine what are the policies either at the government level or at, individual large properties. What are these policies that are really helping um, to hold up barriers to certain populations being able to have true equal access to housing, equal access to not only housing but to neighborhoods and communities of their choice, right? And how can we help break down some of those policies so that we can not only share with folks how to view those policies through a fair housing lens, but also how to really dismantle them, so that we can start reducing the infrastructure that's been built up that prioritizes certain people's needs and wants over others. So that's kind of the work that we do, and we have an office we have two offices, one in Rhode Island, one's in Pawtucket, um, and we have folks that work for us across all of those departments, trying to sort of view. So, in some ways we're similar to a legal services type of nonprofit because we do offer legal services, but we really have a core mission of eliminating housing discrimination and increasing equal housing opportunities. And so all of our work kind of tries to view both assisting individuals, but also trying to break down those patterns, and those practices that are impacting more than just one individual.
What does your fair housing education look like?
Yeah, so our fair housing education includes some different types of work. So we will be at a range of community events, where we might have a table set up. I think that's where we met all of you, at a community event, and that's sort of I really like doing that work because it's often it's the first time that people will even know that we exist. And we're able to give them some basic information here, whether they have a housing issue going on, and kind of also try to put the pieces together for them about, how is this housing issue? How does it maybe relate to housing discrimination, right? Or to a law that you didn't know even existed, or to a right that you didn't know even existed. So we will have tables at a variety of community events when we have the opportunity to do so. We also will offer presentations to various groups, and sometimes we'll do a presentation on fair housing to a first-time homebuyer class. And so new potential landlords are able to understand, get some exposure to the fair housing laws as they may apply to them as a potential landlord, but also as they may apply to them as someone that's in the process of purchasing a home. We offer trainings to staff of other organizations. We also really enjoy, if organizations already have a group of individuals that they're working with in some way. I enjoy like coming in and doing a presentation for that group of individuals, so that folks can understand their rights in that way. And then we also have our social media and our and our website, and we have a range of written materials that we also will hand out to various locations and that are available for download and request from our website. Most of the trainings that I just talked about, we offer at no charge. However, if an entity is needing to receive fair housing training as a result of a case that had been filed against them with the Commission for Human Rights or with HUD, then we charge those folks for those trainings. But other than that, we're happy to entertain requests for presentations from 5 minutes all the way up to a couple of hours. We kind of tailor it to whatever the needs are. And I will, if given the opportunity, I will talk about fair housing for an entire day, but no one's offered to let me do that yet.
Is age a protective class when it comes to fair housing?
Age is protected under Rhode Island state law, yes.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I have some young adult kids, and one of them has friends, a couple, and they were having a heck of a time last year. And he asked, would you just go with them? Like, you don't have to pretend to be their mom or anything, but just go with them so it looks like they have an adult, with them. They actually found a place, but I never even considered that. I mean, in my head, I knew they were being discriminated against because they were kids, but I didn't think they had any recourse to it,
Yeah. And I that's a really good example of how I think folks don't even know what the laws are. And even age discrimination in particular, right? I think sometimes people know that there's an employment discrimination law that protects, I think it's folks that are over the age of 55 from employment discrimination. But with age discrimination, it's really not narrow just to the folks that are older than 55. It includes everyone over the age of 18. And so that's a law specific to Rhode Island. It's not a national protection. And so I think folks don't necessarily immediately think about it or are aware of it.
Now, we heard about discrimination. We've learned some protective classes.
Mm-hmm.
When does South Coast get involved?
So we like to get involved as soon as possible when someone thinks they may have an issue. When working with folks in particular with disabilities who are asking for reasonable accommodations or modifications, we will help those folks, at any stage of the process. Sometimes folks will come to us and they've already made a request of their landlord to make an accommodation in some way, and that request has been denied. And so we can be there to help with follow-up or to pursue a more formal complaint with a government entity who has authority to issue decisions and orders. And I think with folks, with other folks in various situations, right? Like sometimes folks with housing vouchers are experiencing discrimination because they have a housing voucher and they have an apartment. They just need to maybe the landlord just needs a little education about what their obligations are under the laws, right? We're happy to try to assist in that way because we'd rather prevent, more harm than let it get to the point where it's now in a more severe crisis and then we have to step in. So I think at any phase, and even somebody who had already filed a complaint with the Rhode Island Commission for Human Rights contacted us and we were able to step in and represent them in the next phase as well. So kind of I often tell folks, you're not going to necessarily have all the evidence yourself because of the way that discrimination often manifests itself, right? It's not super obvious all the time. Sometimes it's just a gut feeling, right? Like this thing seemed off and I think it was because of my this, right? Call us then. We can listen to you. We can talk to you about your options. We can think through whether there's a way for us to investigate further, right? And maybe we can develop some evidence that you as an individual may not have had the ability to do. And so, and even if you don't pursuing a more formal complaint or asking us for help beyond talking about it, really helps us to understand more about what's happening in the housing market. And it helps us to think about how we need to change our work to meet the needs of what's currently happening. There's only 7 of us full-time working here. Like, we're only gonna, as individuals, engage in so many housing searches ourselves, right? But the more that folks can talk to us and tell us about your experience, what did it look like for you? What did it feel like for you? When did this issue come up? Like, the more that we can help, like, tailor our work to what folks are really experiencing now. So I welcome as many folks to contact us as possible, even if they're not yet ready. If they're not quite sure about whether they're ready to file a formal complaint. That's part of why this organization here is that we're not a government entity. You're not having to start a formal complaint with us. You can just call us, talk about it, and if you decide not to pursue it, that's totally fine, and we're okay with that.
Does sexual harassment or any kind of hostile environment towards renters or homeowners fit into your scope of work?
Yes, absolutely. So when we're talking about discrimination on the basis of sex, or even gender identity, or sexual orientation, right? Sexual harassment is a way that can manifest. And sexual harassment is sort of viewed and, defined in 2 different ways, to include 2 different kinds of harassment, some of which can occur at the same time, right? One is the sort of concept of a hostile environment, sexual harassment, where maybe the extent of comments or that it created such a hostile environment that it would make someone no longer comfortable, like, living in their home, right? Then there's this sort of concept of sexual harassment that is we refer to as quid pro quo sexual harassment. And that's where an individual, maybe a landlord, a maintenance person, or even a housing authority caseworker, maybe they'll tell someone, a tenant, that, I will, I'll forgive this rent that you're late on if you engage in this sexual activity with me. Or I will actually make the repairs that you've been asking for if you engage in this sexual activity with me. And I think when housing markets like we're currently in, when the housing market is such, like right now, where housing is so short, people are having a lot of difficulty affording their homes and affording any home on the market. I think the opportunity for sexual harassers to engage in that behavior increases exponentially. And I think people who experience sexual harassment in their housing don't always know where to turn, and have all of the same barriers to coming forward as in other kinds of housing discrimination. And so it's important for us to talk about it, for folks to even make the connection for folks that sexual harassment is a fair housing issue, is a housing discrimination issue, that there is a law that prohibits it, and that there are people who you can turn to when this is happening to you. And often I think with sexual harassment, right, if someone, a landlord, real estate agent, property manager, if they've engaged in sexual harassment towards one tenant, they will probably have already engaged in sexual harassment against another tenant. And so the more that folks can talk about this, spread the word, come forward, the more that we can, work together to try to get it to stop. Because no one should have to live like that in order to keep a roof over their or their family's heads.
And you're going to see these people all the time too. It's never going to end, right? Well, unless you do something about it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Can you tell us and our listeners a few of the different presentations and classes that South Coast provides?
Yes. So we are happy to sort of talk about in any presentation that we provide, right? We don't typically schedule them on our own. Like we don't, you know, we're not as proactive as you all are, right? In terms of hosting our own podcast and and doing that. But we do we have a place on our website where folks can request a presentation, and we will, you know, we have some sort of standard presentations that we have prepared for on a variety of topics or variety of time slots, but we're also happy to tailor presentations to like what the individual or the organization may need. So, you know, our standard presentations are, you know, we have a standard one that we use at a variety of first-time homebuyer classes just to talk about what are your fair housing and non-discrimination rights when you're buying a home, and what issues do you need to think about if you're thinking about becoming a landlord. Just within the scope of the non-discrimination laws, right? We also have a presentation, you know, a 2 to 3 hour presentation that we have preset for folks who really need to, you know, are being required essentially to receive a fair housing training and to make sure that they are aware of all of their obligations under the laws now. And so we have that training as well. And then we sort of, I've been doing this for many, many years. So I have a I'm happy to sort of I can tailor conversations specifically just to rights of folks with disabilities. Or I just did a workshop the other day focused on sexual orientation and gender identity and fair housing laws. And so we can tailor it based on the kind of housing we're talking about. We can tailor it based on the kind of, you know, specific protected classes. And we can also tailor it based on who we're presenting to, right? Is it is it a group of renters? Is it a group of, you know, homeowners or landlords? Is it a group of caseworkers who may be assisting folks um, who are experiencing housing instability, right? And how can we think through the connection and talk about the connection between that population or, you know, that group and the fair housing laws, and what does it actually look like on the ground to sort of identify, you know, how to respond and what are the red flags, basically.
What would you say your biggest need is right now? Like if community is like, wow, I really love this organization, how can they help? What do you need?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We are different from other organizations in that we don't provide, you know, direct benefits to individuals, right? Like we don't have so we're a little bit different in the kind of services that other nonprofits may provide to folks. But I think we are always in need of like volunteers willing to help with a range of our work, right? If someone's interested in doing community outreach for us, like I would love to have folks interested in doing that and, you know, talking about our work and you know, meeting with individuals all over Rhode Island. I think we are also, you know, always in need of folks, you know, who have a particular interest in working with individuals who contact our office. And I think the big one that I'm so embarrassed that I almost forgot is we're always in need of testers. So I can't believe that was the first thing out of my mouth. We're always
I was gonna
we're always in
that sounds fun.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, we're always in need of testers. We do pay our testers, although if someone needs to pick up community service hours for whatever reason, you know, that works for us too, as far as testers are concerned. But it's a huge part of our work that is one of the ways that makes us very different from every other organization that I'm familiar with in Rhode Island is our testing work. And in order for our testing work to be successful, um, we need a huge and diverse pool of individuals willing to accept assignments from us on, you know, on a case by case basis. And, you know, sometimes it could be just a couple hours a year, right? Or you know, we could be sending you assignments, you know, every couple of weeks. It doesn't have to, it's not a huge commitment, but it can really make the difference between being able to um, support an individual that has experienced housing discrimination with additional evidence or not. And it can really make or break a case. And the other thing that our testing is helpful for is we test even without complaints coming in. So we're constantly testing the marketplace, and the more testers we have and the more diverse representation that we have among our tester pool, the more forms of discrimination that we can test for and investigate and understand, you know, what's happening in this market. And so we have an application right on our website, and we're actively performing trainings. So you know, it would be great if folks are even remotely interested if they fill out an application and we can be in touch.
Be a professional tester.
Sounds fun. I love catching people doing things they're not supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. It is one of the ways to really contribute to civil rights work happening in Rhode Island without, you know, a huge amount of commitment, but knowing that, you know, it makes a huge difference. We couldn't do our work without our testers. And it lets you contribute in a way that works with your schedule. You know, it's not easy, right? Like sometimes it just really sucks to put yourself in a position where you are expecting to be discriminated against, right? But it can also be really empowering to know that you are contributing to the effort across Rhode Island to really break down these barriers that are in place that are preventing all of us from living in diverse, welcoming communities, and prevents our children from oftentimes going to diverse, welcoming schools, right? And so, you know, that little one bit, couple hours, can make a huge difference for us in being able to really understand what's happening, but also to take steps to stop it.
So, Kristina, for those listening, for those who are interested, what's the best way to contact South Coast to become a tester?
So I usually recommend that folks, if they want any more information about us, to stop first at our website, southcoastfairhousing.org. And there's information there about, there's our application for becoming a tester. There's also a form that folks can complete if they want to start the process of talking to us about an issue that they're having, right? So there's an intake form there for that purpose. There's an application form there for becoming a tester. If that doesn't work, they can also contact us at by phone, and that phone number is 401-285-2550. And I'll also mention that our services are available in any language. And you know, we have multilingual staff, but also we actively utilize an interpretation line if necessary, if we don't have on staff communication tools. It is important that we communicate with folks in a range of languages, and that is a priority for us, as it should be for many actual housing providers across the state of Rhode Island. And we'll also accommodate folks with disabilities, right? So if you have a disability that you think is preventing you or creating a barrier that to accessing our services, right? We're willing to accommodate that as well, and do what we need to, whether it's, you know, meeting in person or whatever, using sign language interpreters, whatever is necessary in order for us to be able to communicate with you and work with you. We're happy to do that.
right.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristina. It has been, you've shared so much information.
Very enlightening.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to come up with. Yeah,
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 no.
see?
The heat has got to me in here. But no, very, very enlightening. I didn't know all of those services were available. I thought you were just kind of out of luck if, you know, you're discriminated against, if there are multiple, you know, when it came to housing, if there are multiple different people applying. So this has been very helpful. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate being here. It was really nice to talk with both of you, and thanks for having me. This has been really fun for me. It's fun for me to talk about this, even though it's not a great thing that discrimination still exists. I really enjoy having these conversations and talking about it with folks. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. We all work with a lot of different communities that I know we'll be reaching back out to get your expertise and some help on.
Yes, I hope so. That's what we're here for.
All right.
Have a good day.
You as
Thank
well.
you. All right.